The other day, you said we should do the podcast because it's the only time I enjoy talking to you all right now. That was pretty funny.
I don't think I said it exactly like that.
Maybe you don't.
Well, her follow-up later in the day was, our podcast is like our safe place when we talk about things. I'm like, our safe place is when mics are rolling, mics are hot, tape's rolling, and we record everything we say. That's definitely where we share all the things.
But podcast is really us sitting around talking. Mm-hmm. It really is. I mean, that's about things that we love.
Right.
Not that we don't love the
Other
meetings
things.
we're having.
No, we love the meetings. We love the people in the meetings. We love what we're talking about. It's the most important thing to us.
So great.
No gross, sir. Absolutely.
But
No gross,
first two people at all costs,
Percent.
those are great. Don't get me wrong. But this is my fun time.
We are in the book of Daniel, and last week, if you didn't listen, we encourage you to go back and listen to that, kind of the start of this conversation. And so we're going to take, chapter at a time or so, and today we're doing chapter 1. And, I would encourage you, before you listen to this, read chapter 1. I think it'll help you as we go along. It's one thing just to listen to us talk about it, but we always encourage you to read it for yourself. And so, we don't necessarily read it verse by verse on here, but we do kind of recall what's going on. So let's start there, y'all. What is happening here in Daniel 1?
Well, Joey, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, the king of Babylon, who's named Nebuchadnezzar, he came to Jerusalem and besieged it. That's what you're asking.
That is.
This is not hard to understand at this point in the book.
You know what? And actually, I think all of chapter 1 is spelled out incredibly.
It is. It's
probably more than other narratives in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. It is incredibly straightforward. Yeah. It tells you exactly what is going on.
I'm afraid to read Daniel. So hard to understand. Have you read Daniel?
Right.
Yeah. It starts off fairly on the nose.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we talked about this last week. There's this exile going on. What is the exile? Why were there exiles? Why in the history of Israel was that happening?
Because they did not do what God said.
Yep.
And he warned them over and over and over in Deuteronomy 28 and all the prophets and all of that. And God said, I am just and I will keep my promises. And
so there's a giving over of them.
Yeah.
They were preserved, they were protected, through the journey to the promised land. Like they beat armies like way bigger than them.
Think God, Gideon, all those stories.
Yeah. I mean, God had so much preservation for his chosen people. And at some point, there are consequences for our actions. Mm-hmm. And there's a letting over of them. And that's what's happening in this exile here. And so they're in Babylonian captivity. And, we talked about this last week too, but, it says that God handed over them to, and so just
Syrians.
Just knowing that God is still in control of us, even though they're having consequences for their actions.
If you haven't listened to the first episode, I think we talked about it. Like this is like the first of 3 exiles. Yeah. Like this is just a partial exile. Right. This isn't the complete one yet. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So just getting started.
But we can say that one of the things that again is super straightforward. Mm-hmm. One of the things that seemed to have been customary was when one nation conquered another, they took the best and the brightest of the youth back to their country to enculturate them. So that's kind of what we see next.
Yeah, so they take these group of young men and they basically train them up for 3 years. And they say, hey, you're going to come learn our customs. You're going to adapt to who we are and the way we do things. We're even going to change your name. And so they change name. And then quickly you get into the day in the life of those 3 years. And the day in the life of those 3 years is, for some reason, like food, I don't know why, was a big deal. But like they mentioned, I think it's a big deal because of what ends up happening and what Daniel ends up doing with it. But one of those customs is that you get the food and the drink from the king.
Right.
And you kind of get wined and dined a little bit. And so we have this event immediately out of the gates that Daniel declines that. And he asks for something really abnormal, even today.
Which is vegetables and water.
Which is veggies and water, yeah. And asked for that. And then after that, the story, the way it's written is that they were stronger. These men were stronger after that. And
these men being Daniel
and his friends. His three friends.
Three friends.
Yeah.
Whose names
Well,
change.
I'm trying to remember because like I don't even remember their Hebrew names. I only remember
Their Babylonian,
their changed
their
names,
Syrian
Shadrach,
names.
Meshach, and Abednego. What were their original
Yeah,
names?
so in verse 7, we get their names and then
There we
their
go.
changed names. And so I'm going to butcher them. But Daniel, he called Belteshazzar.
Yeah.
Belshazzar.
Yeah, thank you.
Hananiah.
Hananiah, he called Shadrach. Mishael, he called Meshach. And then Azariah, he called Abednego.
Yeah.
Yep.
So there you go. And so there's this encounter with the chief eunuch and the one that's providing the food and these guys, and they say, no, we're not going to do it. And then the way that like the resolving action of this chapter is that verse 17, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And so after these 3 years, he goes before the king, and his three friends go before the king. And in verse 20, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding above which the king inquired about them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom, and Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. So that's kind of the...
That was the hardest thing I've ever done.
Did
To
you
not stop and be like, oh, this is what I think this means, and this is what I think that means, and let's talk about what this might mean and what we can learn from this.
Yeah, so now that we have... And so we really enjoy the application. We go and we say, okay, what's the application? So it is really good to know what's happening in the narrative at that time. That's just good
Have
observation.
to observe it.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we have a personal question, like what the first question is after that is, what did you learn? What did you receive? What did you see? What are the timeless truths that exist in this passage that stands out to you?
Well, I think I had a lot of questions.
Okay.
When I, just from observe and then interpret, how do I interpret this before I even got there was, you brought it up, like why the food? Why was the food the line?
Mm-hmm.
And then the next step is, well, where is my line?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, so I observed it. I had some interpretive questions, like why was that? And then what does that matter for me? But I had a bunch of them. The other part that got me to stop and think was, what caused them not to play the victim? Like there was a point where they could have been like, well, God clearly doesn't love us. He sent us into this captivity. Now here we are, separated from our families.
Yeah.
We don't have our sacred texts anymore. We're being forced to learn the language and the literature. You know what I mean? Like, what was it about who they were and what they knew and who they knew that allowed them to, like, they're awesome through this whole thing. They like ask permission. They do all of these very lovely things while they are trying not to get assimilated. So I had all of those questions. Like, what are we supposed to do with all that?
It was similar. I said Daniel somehow was able to balance cultural adaptation and faithfulness to God. It was both. It wasn't either or. He wasn't all in on the culture and just like,
I'll do whatever.
I'll do whatever. It was like, hey, I'm going to learn the language. I'm going to be a good citizen.
I'll assimilate insofar as I can still obey what I believe God has told me to do.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Let me think about the cultural adaptation. You learn a new culture, and that's learning behaviors and social skills. Every culture is different, so there's incorporating elements of different customs and cultures into your own way of thinking. It can refer to the ability of people and societies to adapt to changes in their environment, and so there was a lot going on. And going back to the question, then how were they able to know the line? How were they able to see, okay, I can go up to this point and not eat the royal food? So what do you,
I mean, they obviously knew what their scripture taught, so Torah. They would have had, scrolls at that point. We at least know that much. So it would have been written down. They would have known it. And there's a couple different ways that's been interpreted. They didn't eat the food because it violated like the dietary laws of the Torah, or that it violated a provision such as, don't eat food that's been sacrificed to idols. So one of the views historically would have been that, the food that the king ate would have also been the same food they would have, given to Baal or whatever, that kind of thing. So either way, they're being obedient to what they believe is God's revealed truth. So they would have been exposed to that. So then if I'm them, I'm going, we're obedient. Why are we here? You know, because literally the first thing you see is, you know, they're in exile because they haven't been obedient to God's word. But the first thing you see is 3 or 4 guys being obedient to God's word. It's like, so those things can coexist apparently.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. So that's one of the things I saw from that. It's like,
yeah. And, you know, I think sometimes people maybe get weary of us kind of saying the same things over and over, but it bears repeating this, the tension that they are resting in and not trying to resolve, which is really good. And so,
and also it's important to remember we only see a snapshot here.
Because Daniel wasn't perfect.
And
his friends weren't perfect. Yeah.
And because, you know, if you're reading the book of Acts, it's like, man, they were just like, that's all they did.
Yeah.
They just got up each day and got on a boat and went and shared the gospel.
That's
What they did that particular Tuesday they wrote about.
That's right.
But we don't know the intervening months or whatever. Correct. It's like, these are just normal people going about their lives kind of thing.
Yep.
And,
I can imagine the 4 of them.
Teenagers, for goodness sakes.
Yeah.
You know?
17 to 20 years old, and they're just sitting there and they're just probably debating, like, do we do this? Do we not do this? What is the line?
Right.
They're probably sitting around a round table like this with some mics in their face and trying to figure it out.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm sure the king's food looked pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
I just think that there was for me, what stood out to me was they didn't make it about themselves.
Yeah. Right.
They were making it about God.
Right.
It wasn't about us.
It wasn't about how far can I go before I cross the line. It was how can I honor the Lord.
That's right.
It's the difference of questions.
Right.
We get that question a lot. Like, well, how far before it becomes sin? Well, it's the wrong mind frame, frame of mind. It is, how can I honor God in the situation? There's no question about how, can I just have the appetizer?
Well, and doesn't that ultimately come down to a level of trust?
Right.
Do I trust God? Do I trust that his ways are higher?
Yeah.
Because when I'm asking how far can I go, what I'm really saying is my ways are higher.
Yeah.
You know, what I think is going to satisfy me is what's best.
And Daniel's acting, and again, Jeff, I love your point that this is what we were reading in that day. Like, I don't think Daniel knew the whole story, right? We know the whole story of what ends up happening.
In hindsight.
So Daniel's like, I don't think I should do this. Maybe veggies and water. And I don't know if I'm going to be strong. Like, there was no declaration that he would be stronger. He just said, let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Ooh, I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that. Verse 8 says Daniel made up his mind.
He made up his mind to do that. He had a resolve.
You didn't know if the veggies would make him stronger.
Right.
Gotcha. I misinterpreted what you said.
Now we knew after that they were stronger.
Right, got it.
But he's like in faith. Like,
actually, the only thing he says is just, hey, see if we're any worse off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He doesn't necessarily expect God to come through with over and above. It's just see if we can maintain status quo by not doing that.
Right.
That kind of thing. So, but just Daniel's posture and all this is like he resolves. The ESV, Lori, says that Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself, right? So, again, that's based on some objective standard outside of himself, which would have been Torah, I'm sure. But then he asked the chief eunuch.
Yeah.
He didn't demand it.
Right.
He didn't say, these are my rights as a Hebrew that you've imported and yada, yada. Like, he didn't make a stump speech. He's like, hey, can I have a second?
Yeah.
What if?
Yeah.
Yep.
Kind of thing. And just his posture, just the trust in God vertically, the humility horizontally. It's like there's a kind of love God, love people, great commandment principle even seeing played out here. It's like we don't know what he would have done if the eunuch said no. Like he might have then drew a line in the sand.
Yep.
We do know is that verse 9 says God gave Daniel favor and compassion.
That's right. Yep.
And then he involved his friends. Like he starts off just involving himself. And then he starts introducing the idea. So, hey, for me and my 3 buddies over here, can we all do this? Like he's so measured in how he does this, and just the application of wisdom based on revealed truth is just very striking.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what you just said in there, I think bleeds into this next question, which is, what is practical for us today in our culture? So that we just covered the bucket of timeless truths, and now we get to this contextualized application for 2024 and where we find ourselves. And that was what you just said is what I wrote down was this resolve and maturity that he had
as a teenager.
For sure. And verse 19 says, "None was found like Daniel. Daniel's resolve and patience and reasonableness, his maturity, his wisdom, his understanding led to. Well, I said led to God's favor, but he had God's favor that motivated him to live out in this way, and then it led to an ability. His resolve and maturity led to the ability to have influence and lead in the culture.
Which eventually gave him the opportunity to just say a flat no.
Yeah.
At various times, but he didn't start there by assuming he had some rights that just weren't his. That authority had been bestowed upon someone else.
Right.
Yep.
At that point,
And I might argue that comes from what I think is an overarching principle in this text. Practically, is that this whole godliness thing is not accidental. He didn't stumble upon this. Right. He did know Torah. He had trained. Yeah. In godliness, you
there was a
flash
level
back
of
to first. That's right, preparation. Yeah, we're not going to accidentally act in godly ways when we are in a foreign culture. Right. It's not just going to bubble up and bubble out. You think through 1 Timothy, and I think it's chapter 4 that talks about train yourself for godliness. Right. For a while, the bodily training is of some value. Right. Spiritual training is eternal. And so I think that is an overarching principle is this didn't just happen. Yeah, because then, I think if we live daily in the, and you talked about this last week, Jeff, about getting off of Twitter and how that's impacted you positively, I think if we are just a product of the culture, we're no different, even though we're taking stands against, we're just acting like we're stooping down to that level as opposed to rising up and being above the fray. And so Daniel wasn't taking a stand for taking a stand's sake. He wasn't he wasn't unreasonably defiant to the culture. He waited in intention.
And you go back to verse 4 and the only reason he is even in this situation is because he was known to be skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding learning. I have to look that up. There's not a comma between those two words. Incompetent to stand in the king's palace. So he's in this because of some reputation he had coming in. Yeah. Which is, I wish the author had given a little more space to that. Yeah. I would love to know what that looked like, why it looked that way. Right. Who else was in this? I mean, sure, there was more than just the 4 of them, but only these 4 do we hear about doing this kind of stuff. Just stand out.
The other thing I have here for contextualized application for us is, and we've hit on this numerous times, but just that God, and Laura, you're really good about every time I have a conversation about any part of the book of the Bible is that we are not the main character, but God is the main character. So we can say, that Daniel's mentioned a lot here, but look at how God's moving the chess pieces. Yep. Verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, which then put Daniel in this difficult situation, but a situation, opportunity to exercise faith and show off God's power. Verse 9, God gave Daniel favor and compassion, to which then Daniel stewarded this provision well by acting in boldness and in a courageous way to not eat and drink the king's provisions, but instead veggies and water. And then verse 17, God gave them, Daniel and his friends, learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And then Daniel then faithfully stewarded this well by having understanding in dreams and visions, and he became 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the kingdom.
Well, can we stop right there? Because I think that's so good of how did he get 10 times better? What was he getting better at? He was getting better at learning the literature and the wisdom of the Babylonians. Right?
Yeah.
And God used that.
Yeah.
He didn't say he was getting better at learning the sacred text of the Hebrews. God used that.
Yeah.
To make him excel. And so I use this sometimes when I'm talking with parents who are so scared to let their kids into our culture, understandably. This is a nasty place right. that we are currently living. But we have to trust that whatever Babylon is teaching them, God is going to help us interpret that to them. And that's clearly what's happening. Babylon taught them these things. Yeah. They're learning how to interpret dreams. They're learning how to be better than the magicians. Well, how? Because they're showing them their ways.
Yep.
And somehow God, who's the main character and is in control of this, redeems it and interprets it to them.
That's convicting to me because verse 20, this was where you're at, I guess.
Right,
verse 20.
17 and
Every
20.
matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them.
100%.
So not even wisdom and understanding about their own beliefs, but wisdom and understanding about what the king wanted to know.
Yep.
It wasn't about God.
There's somehow that we honor God by serving the culture on its terms. Now, as I say that, I'm like, I just said something wrong. But I think that's true.
I do. It has to be.
We have to somehow engage culture on its terms to prove our ability, I guess, to reason well, to think well, to understand them, kind of seeking to understand them so that they might want to seek to understand what.
Totally.
Us.
And
there's something there. There's a huge tension. Like I feel it in my bones.
But it's so good.
But all truth is God's truth. And so while we're engaging a certain culture, there is the redemptive thread through it. And we need to engage that redemptive thread using their language, using their whatever, and not becoming oil and water.
Right.
And separating ourselves completely.
It's Paul and Acts.
Yeah.
At the Areopagus, or however you say it.
Yeah.
You know, it's like he entered into their conversation.
Yeah.
Right.
And spoke to them on their terms to reveal.
Using their
truth.
poetry, using their...
Which we are a post-Christian nation. And people want to drag, and we are a Christian nation. We are founded on Christian principles. And it's like, well, hold on. Times change. Culture changes. And we are. And so we are now foreigners. I mean, I said this before, but I'm kind of building up my children to be like, hey, guys, you're going to be the odd ones in the culture. It's not going to be normative to believe what we believe.
Right.
And so how do we engage that? How do we engage that well?
Good.
Oh, I just think what we talk about in our house is... how can you continue to be culturally relevant without becoming spiritually irrelevant?
Unpack that a little bit.
Well, so if we are oil and water, if we are so different that we're weird and unattractive, we become culturally irrelevant.
Yeah.
In order to be spiritually relevant.
Right.
Well, but are you being spiritually relevant if you're being culturally irrelevant? Because who are you then ministering to?
Yeah. Right.
Who is seeing you as salt and light? Who gets the chance to see you being spiritually relevant? Other spiritual people, which that's okay. There's times for that. But we have to figure out how to do what Daniel and his friends did, which is to hear the language of the culture and interpret it through the lens of God.
Yeah, totally.
The solution isn't don't hear the language of culture.
Absolutely.
The solution is interpret it through the lens of God.
Yeah. The next thing on our outline is where else in Scripture does this talk about the things that we're talking about right now. And I think of Philippians 4, just let your reasonableness be made known to man.
There you go.
And I love asking people, man, you're real fired up about this. But those that you're talking to and arguing with, would they say the character trait of reasonableness about you?
Right.
And we want to do this in a way that there's this calm steadiness, this resolve, as Daniel was able to do it.
You know how we know he did it? Because verse 10, so remember like Jeff said, he seeks permission to do this. And in verse 10, the commanding officer says, well, I'm afraid of my Lord the King who has appointed your food and your drink. Why should they say that you look more haggard? He's saying, I'm afraid that you would look bad in front of the king, and I don't want that for you.
Wow, yeah.
I'm afraid this is going to be bad for you.
Yep.
So the commanding officer, there was something about Daniel.
Yep.
That he was like, are you sure you want to do this? I'm trying to protect you, bud.
Yep, that's good.
And Daniel's like, nope, let's go.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's really good. I also thought of a couple of chapters, verses here. So Colossians 3:1-2 says, if then you've been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things that are above, not on things of this earth. It's, Daniel lived for a higher calling. It wasn't he didn't do this just to not be killed. Matter of fact, we're going to get to a place where he walks right into a furnace.
Don't give it away.
Spoiler alert.
People don't know that's what's going to happen.
And so he's just he had this eternal perspective and this eternal mindset. But my absolute and Jeff, you really talked a lot about this earlier. But I thought of Ephesians 4. 11 through 16, and I don't know if I'll read it all. Let's see. But Paul's talking about being equipped, for the work of ministry. And then he talks about for what reason. It's to get to a place of maturity in the faith, in the gospel, to the fullness of Christ, to not stay in this adolescent spirituality, and not to be tossed by waves of every cultural issue. But I love this because it talks about not getting tossed. And I think of Daniel, not being tossed to and fro, but he had this steadiness. And then it says, for what purpose? Or how do we do this? Speak truth in love. Verse 15, rather, speaking truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. And he goes on, and later on, verse 16, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. So love is this ethic that grounds every motivation of growing, of being equipped, of having the answers, godly answers, redemptive answers in the midst of culture. Not to hold up our fists and start swinging, right?
Right.
And so, I don't know.
Yeah, and it's like wisdom. It's like there's knowledge and then there's wisdom, which is the correct application of knowledge.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, there's knowledge and there's action, which is the right application of the knowledge that you have. And so faith without works is dead. So it takes you to James, right? That's what I think of in this. Like he not only knew things, he knew what to do with what he knew when given the opportunity.
So good.
You know, and man, I mean, he's one of the few, maybe the only, one of the only ones in Scripture that does Daniel make a misstep in the entire book? I mean, he gets exhausted and overwhelmed.
Yeah.
But is there an example of him lacking faith or
Not that I
lacking
can think
courage?
of.
Or
We'll find out
But
in a
now I'll
couple
be
weeks.
looking for it.
yeah, you know what I mean? But it's like, that's kind of a rare thing in Scripture.
Yeah, totally.
Not that he was perfect. We only have the accounts of when he did it well. But
We have his highlight reel.
yeah, we have his highlight reel. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, that's good. Other scriptures you guys think about?
I think I went to 1 John, just don't love the world or anything in it. You know, just kind of where we were talking about a minute ago.
Eternal mindset.
Yeah, that eternal mindset. It didn't mean that he hated the world. He just didn't look to it for fulfillment or for, you know, attaboys, for lack of a better word.
Or to make his condition any more comfortable for him. Yeah, that's interesting.
I think sometimes we read that verse, hate the world. No, just don't love it.
Yeah.
Just don't look to it for satisfaction.
Right. Because it won't anyway. It's a hamster
I've tried
wheel.
it. I'm just going to tell you right now. It doesn't work.
Yeah, totally. Man, there was some good dense stuff. Like, I can't wait to listen to this because there were some things that you guys were saying. I want to listen again, but I just want to make sure any closing pastoral acknowledgments. Laura, you mentioned this earlier. We joked about having this in both of our notes, but you know, we act in fear and trepidation in the midst of our culture, and any other things that are against the Lord when we're not a people of the Word. When we're not in the Word, reading the Word, receiving the Word in our hearts and minds, and then what Jeff just talked about, that our knowledge would lead to the right action, that our right orthodoxy leads to the right orthopraxy. And, you know, I admire, you know, I talked about this a little bit last week, I think, but I was convicted when I was reading about Daniel, and then still today in my life, when things get hard or difficult, I freak out. And I get a little chaotic, and it's like, man, I want to be like Dave. I want to be resolved. I want people to describe me as reasonable and resolved, steady. Joey is steady, and that is not what is said about me. And I want it to be. I want to read the Bible. I want to trust it. I want to model men like Daniel. I want to be more like Daniel, and not like the pharaohs and kings of the world who were always freaking out, looking for people to interpret their dreams. Come help me out. Oh my goodness, what's going on? The world is coming to an end.
Right.
And it's like, man, the man of God is always just really resolved.
Yeah, because here's the things that I noticed, like in just big picture here. So the chapter is bookended by the first verse and the last verse.
Oh, wow.
I know.
Deep.
But
Deep.
Both of those have a timestamp.
Oh, yeah.
So
that's
1:1, the third year of Jehoiakim's reign, approximately 605 BC. 121 says that Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus, which is probably 539. So this kid, who's a teenager, is in the situation for 65 to 70 years, depending on how you date it, right? And in between those timestamps, verse 1-2, we see God is responsible for judgment, like you talked about. Verse 9, God's responsible for the blessing they received. You talked about that. And then 17 is the gifts and abilities they received were also given by God. So in the midst of this really long timeline, God's at work, but their situation is still not good. But God's still at work. And they're still faithful, and God's still at work. But they're still in captivity, but God's still at work. And so if there's a pastoral encouragement here, it's just like, I hope your situation is quick. You just don't know. You just don't know. This was the first of 3 exiles. So they're there as more Hebrews are still getting shipped over time, right? He's seeing all of it. And he also knows Jeremiah's prophecy going, yep, Jeremiah was right.
Yeah.
But God's still faithful. God's still blessing. God's still in charge of all this somehow, even though in these bookends, it may not feel that way.
Right.
And so I don't know what the encouragement is then, other than just that God is in control of it.
Yeah.
It just may take a while to see how.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the encouragement is that when we see our situation and make it about ourselves, we're going to live in fear and we're going to live in unsettledness.
Yeah.
And when we see our situation and make it about God, we are going to have that peaceful resolve. We are.
Yeah.
You know, and that's big for me. And I can usually see a shift in my entire life when I'm in a bad situation and I go, okay, wait a minute. This is a bad situation.
Yeah.
It is also not about me.
Yeah.
It is about God.
Right.
And he's in control, like you were saying, no matter what this situation looks like. And so it seems simple for the pastoral encouragement to be like, well, this isn't about you. It's about God. And you can live with resolve and peacefulness when you don't think you're the main character, which is hard.
No, I think what we've been talking about is really shifting and changing and like a transplant of a mindset. These mindsets have to change. We have to go from it's about me and what about me to it's about God and trusting God. It's a discipline. You have to discipline yourself to continually do that, and that's hard, but it's a worthy discipline and it's a worthy.
The way Brad says it, I mean, he said it this past Sunday. Is, quit asking why and start asking what. Like, what is God trying to teach me? What is God doing? Because again, that question then becomes about him and not about why me kind of thing. And I've said this before on here. It's like, and I hope these are things I don't have to apply anytime soon. Like, these things are true.
I know.
And I encourage you to apply these things right now. And I hope I don't have to. But I mean, at the end of the day, we want to live in line with what we know to be true.
Yeah.
So it's kind of good to say it out loud to just remind yourself.
So that it's on, it's recorded that we once said that it's not about us.
100%.
That's right. Yeah.
One of you play it back for me when I need it.
That's right.
Exactly.
We hope that these podcasts encourage you, but we would also encourage you not to go at this walk in the Lord and this life alone. And we encourage you to get into community wherever you're listening to this. Find a local church that opens the Word. And if you're here in Austin, we would encourage you to come here and get involved into community. And we'll be back next week.